the prophecy states that which was dead will rise back from the ashes. Every phoenix must be reborn.
Look, what can I say? Times are changing fast. Feels like only yesterday that you just got that pair of super baggy acne jeans, or maybe they were jaded, and you had one of the best fits on TikTok. But suddenly, more and more you look around, it feels like jeans are getting tighter. With more and more people getting their jeans from Bosnia, it's irrefutable. We are in the return of the Hedi Boy era. What's good, everybody? It's Carson Craning, back at it again with another YouTube video. Today we are talking about the return of the Hedi Boy. If you don't know what an Hedi Boy is, it's someone who follows the aesthetic guidelines or is a fan of the designer Hedi Slimane. Hedi Slimane formerly designed at fashion houses Dior, Saint Laurent, and Celine. And Slimane really pioneered the skinny rock star look. And while he has been intermittently very popular over the last 30 years, his style is coming back more popular than ever. So why is Hedi's work resurging at such an extreme level? It's been almost 25 years since his tenure started at Dior. So why now is it the styles from that era that are flooding the underground fashion culture and music scenes? And here's the other mind-blowing thing about it. Hedi Slimane might not even make $1 off of this huge trend of his style becoming popular again. And that's what we're gonna get into today. But to first figure this out, we have to understand who Hedi Slimane really is. Hedi Slimane was born in Paris in 1968, and growing up he was very inspired by rock music. From the likes of the Velvet Underground to Jimi Hendrix, The Clash, The Ramones, Iggy Pop, The Doors, The Rolling Stones, Joe and Jet, the list goes on. Hedi was just a massive fan of all types of rock. Whether it was surf rock, glam rock, psychedelic, early indie alternative, new wave, punk, Hedi was really obsessed with not only rock music, but the style that went along with it. There was one particular artist who inspired Slimane more than any other, and that artist was David Bowie. David Bowie is certainly well known for his amazing music, but also his performative sensibilities and the way he would embody his work into the way he dressed. He would often have all these elaborate costumes and clothes to represent characters and subjects that were in his musical work. One of the best and most famous examples of this is Ziggy Stardust. However, one of the lesser known characters that Bowie dressed up as was a character known as the Thin White Duke. Instead, this very monotone, clean-cut, sleek character who would wear these very specifically tailored suits, which would accentuate David Bowie's figure to make him look very unnaturally tall and thin, hence the name Thin White Duke. But it was this sleek, tailored, almost inhumanly tall, thin look that would be so massive for Slimane. Slimane would become really obsessed with the general silhouette and would sort of embody it for the rest of his career. However, a young Slimane who would have dreams of working in fashion in his adolescence would eventually actually give up on these dreams. He would, however, find a second love in his adolescence though, which was photography. And he deemed photography to be a more stable career option than to attempt to go into fashion. So he would go to pursue a degree in photojournalism and politics, but then would pivot to instead study art history in the hopes of being able to do marketing photography instead of journalism. Slimane would very quickly gravitate again towards his love of fashion. And by the time he was 24, he ended up working for Louis Vuitton on their marketing and PR team, where he worked and helped organize a number of marketing campaigns. Slimane would quickly grow a reputation as an impressive tastemaker of youth culture. The Parisian fashion world was quickly impressed by the young abilities of Slimane, how he knew how to capture what was in vogue and find what was cool and subversive. Hedi was sort of just able to know what was going to blow up, what was just underground enough to be cool, but wasn't too obscure. There's a very fine line that Hedi knew how to balance. This led to Yves Saint Laurent hiring him in 1996 and making them, instead of a marketing director, as the director of ready-to-wear. However, like I stated earlier, Slimane had never had any formal design experience, which was a risky move to put someone who has never had any formal design experience as the director of the ready-to-wear of a luxury fashion house. However, the head of Saint Laurent had done this because he wanted to bring a more youthful edge to the aging house of Saint Laurent. Like Gucci had done with the very similar Tom Ford, and his taste-making abilities could revive the house and give it a youthful edge and a new customer base. Slimane would begin to slowly try to revitalize the house. While he was gaining good press and positive reception for his work, revitalizing a brand is a slow and difficult task, especially for a very young, inexperienced Slimane, who would still be developing their own style and sensibilities, and he started to create a more sleek and modern look for the brand. While this was received positively, you can still tell that Slimane was developing in this era. It wasn't enough to dramatically boost sales, and so eventually the House of Saint Laurent fell from its original owners and was bought by Gucci under Tom Ford. Tom Ford and the rest of the Gucci team couldn't really see eye to eye on Slimane's creative vision, and so Slimane ended up leaving Saint Laurent. Slimane's reputation at YSL, however, was getting him attention, and Dior ended up placing Slimane as their creative director just months after his contract with YSL ended. So in 2001, Slimane would take up the role as creative director of menswear for the newly formed Dior Homme, and this is where Slimane really began to shine as a designer and lean into his own unique creative vision. Slimane's tenure at Dior would be nothing short of genius and extremely successful. While his time at YSL, Slimane really used to develop and create some of these base silhouettes that he would carry for the rest of his career. It was Dior where he really began to shine creatively. Slimane, of course, was inspired by a myriad of rock stars that he had grown up listening to, and created a wild amount and array of looks that were inspired from everything from glam rock, psychedelic rock, grunge, punk, new wave, garage rock, and goth. Hedi's work at Dior represented this sort of hedonistic recklessness and cocaine-fueled love letter to rock music as a whole. Again, he was pulling from an extremely wide range of rock influence, whether it was the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, Sonic Youth, the Stooges, the Doors. All of these very unique and different aesthetics were extremely well synthesized by Slimane, able to unite it all under his own silhouette. There was also this sort of loose in the styling during this Dior era that felt very rebellious and allowed for a lot of creativity in the styling. I think there's sort of a misconception around Hedi's work, that it was just sort of a rehashing of old rock star looks, just giving you new skinny jeans and leather jackets and boots. And yes, while it is that in some ways, Hedi during this era was doing more than just rehashing old looks. And he also was creating a lot more dynamic, creative, and even avant-garde looks in some senses. And Hedi's work would end up impressing so many people in the fashion industry, including the likes of Karl Lagerfeld. During Hedi's tenure at the Dior, he would end up popularizing the skinny suit, which is a super skinny suit and tie, and this became a very popular and trendy look during the 2000s. The looks Hedi was also creating for Dior also had a super profound impact on the indie sleaze scene or style, which would have been called hipster back then, but we call it indie sleaze now. And this was very deliberate on the part of Slimane. Famously, Slimane would end up gifting Dior wardrobes to a lot of these up-and-coming underground alternative musical artists, including acts such as most famously the Libertines, but also Interpol, The Strokes, and not just rock bands too, but electronic groups like Justice and Crystal Castles would be seen wearing Hedi Slimane's Dior. And because of this very deliberate gifting, the look of Dior really had this concrete relationship with the underground indie sleaze music scene, which ended up just making Slimane's work ultra successful. It made Hedi's Dior be the perfect balance of counterculture and commercial appeal. Hedi was just amazing at taste making and placing really cool items on very specific countercultural figures. And that's where a lot of Dior's success was at, was Hedi's ability to taste make and to find cool musical groups to integrate with the Dior Homme story at the time. This ensured a lot of sales for Dior. Hedi's time at Dior was an immense commercial success. I mean, just to sort of grasp how successful it was, we're still seeing the repercussions of Hedi's work to this day. Hedi's slim, skinny suits are influenced the way suits would be cut for the next 20 years. I mean, even today, when most men walk into a suit shop to get a suit for a wedding or prom or just maybe their corporate lifestyle, they will likely be getting a slimmer suit, and that's because of Slimane's impact. But it was the jeans that sold the best for Dior. Dior jeans and skinny jeans in general were launched into a massive heightened popularity because of Hedi's time at Dior. And Dior jeans from this era still go for massive amounts and are extremely coveted. Dior saw massive success from Slimane, and one that isn't normally seen in menswear luxury fashion houses. Hedi Slimane basically proved that menswear could be taken to new heights. And for luxury houses financially, it was worth their investment. Somewhere along the line, contract negotiations didn't exactly work out, and both parties became unhappy with the current contract they were under. It culminated into Hedi Slimane leaving Dior in 2007. Hedi left Dior in 2007. He would eventually move from Paris to Los Angeles, and he would focus on his second love, photography, for about 5 years, until he would get a new offer for a new role as the creative director, Yves Saint Laurent. As you all know, YSL was the first house that Hedi really ever got to work on, and for 12 years actually, YSL had not been doing well. So Hedi came on to complete the task that he had initially started, and he decided to basically do a complete rebrand and brand overhaul in order to basically modernize it and in turn save the brand. A key understanding of what Hedi wanted to do with Saint Laurent was to modernize it with the changing tastes from the 2000s to the 2010s. He wanted to match Saint Laurent's new branding with a sort of minimalist, clean luxury vision that was becoming more and more in vogue, and it was sort of associated with the likes of maybe the Apple Store. Luxury was no longer about being super ornate or reckless feeling. Instead, he wanted luxury to sort of match the 2010s luxury, which was this elegant, sleek, minimal, modern feel. And this rebranding basically changed everything about Saint Laurent. That included changing storefronts and even the name, changing it from the original Yves Saint Laurent to Saint Laurent Paris, or SLP, as it matched with the tastes that consumers were changing in. In Dior, it was all about sort of the indie sleaze, reckless, elements of ornate or the old, but now luxury was conceived as being put together, sort of this millennial minimalism. And so Hedi, very much in this whole rebranding, worked to appease that consumer base. And so Saint Laurent Paris was really this move out of this sort of sleazed, drugged up rock star look into a refined, more sleek, tech adjacent look. It's still rock star-esque, and I'm not saying tech in terms of like technical design, but in reference to the changing audience Hedi Slimane was trying to appeal to with SLP. Hedi wasn't really trying to appeal to young, aspiring rock stars, but rather young, wealthy, tech and finance individuals who wanted to have trendy, sort of sexy, rock star looking clothing. Big key understanding here is this is not the same consumer base that Hedi Slimane is designing clothes for. They want to market themselves towards young, wealthy individuals. Hedi's greatest success at Dior had been selling jeans, creating a product. And so a big part here of Hedi's work was to sell product. Hedi would sort of work to refine the styles that sold well while he was under Dior and make them more appealing products that could sell well and hopefully take Saint Laurent from a brand in financial distress to a brand that was a financial powerhouse. And Slimane really did just that. The collections he put out at SLP were these very consumable, sleek, appealing takes on what he had done at Dior. They were a lot more sleek, a lot more minimal, but also a lot more refined as a vision. It's sort of a cleaned up version of that luxury that he had at Dior. And basically, Hedi turned SLP into the pinnacle of luxury fashion in the early 2010s. Hedi Slimane tripled Saint Laurent's profits under his reign and turned it into a billion-dollar company. Under Hedi's creative vision, they were able to open more and more stores, sell more and more products, all under Hedi's sort of formula of selling fine, sleek, skinny jeans, boots, and jackets. Basically, Hedi created the millennial luxury uniform. But I want to be clear, financial success does not always mean artistic success. And there was sort of a neutering for creativity for Hedi in this era, sort of becoming sterilized and formulaic. Also, sort of became clear that Saint Laurent and Hedi's work became a lot more corporate and less culturally subversive during this time. I think the best way to describe Saint Laurent Paris under Hedi is it sort of was like iPhone or Apple Store rock and roll. And look, even the names of the clothes under this era were sort of trying to appeal to a young tech background. For example, the naming conventions of the jeans were like DO2. Hedi also really lost a connection to the youth culture that made his tenure at Dior so successful. It's like sort of this underground youth culture that really gave so much rise to the success of Hedi Slimane originally. And for him to sort of lose it with Saint Laurent really made the brand feel a lot more mainstream, almost sellout-y, and for sure less subversive or interesting. I also want to say, it feels like Hedi really tried to connect with a more underground emerging music scene during this era, but it just didn't really work. It kind of seems clear that as Hedi Slimane got older, his ability to be a tastemaker and to pick out underground acts that would be successful and represent youth culture just didn't do as well at that. While Slimane did do a lot of cool work with the likes of Daft Punk, Ariel Pink, The Garden, Kim Gordon, and Marilyn Manson, it didn't really hit the same way for younger audiences. A lot of these artists felt older or too obscure to really connect with a younger, more underground audience. Instead of subversive underground culture makers, SLP was sort of became the uniform of more established and mainstream celebrities. Like, for example, Harry Styles or Scott Disick, G-Eazy. And listen, while Hedi at Saint Laurent was very successful financially, there was also a lot of pressure on him to perform well. It really seemed to wear on Slimane. These creative restraints and also the pressure to only create consumable runways eventually really wore on Slimane. That, along with a contract dispute, led to Slimane leaving the brand in 2016. And of course, Slimane would go back into focusing on his photography until 2019, when Slimane announced he would be taking the helm of Celine from Phoebe Philo. Slimane's vision that he brought to Celine was incredibly stark and different, and not a lot of the brand sensibilities that Phoebe Philo had sort of established carried over into Hedi's work. It didn't help that Phoebe Philo really had an incredibly large and loyal cult following that did not want to see her tenure at Celine end, but you can't really expect a new creative director to honor the previous director's creative vision. That's not what creative directors do. However, for Slimane, Celine seemed to be a better fit, and they gave him a way more creative freedom than SLP ever did. Hedi has gotten a lot more expressive and free reign of what he wanted to send down the runway during Celine, while Slimane has stayed vision to the silhouettes and skinny cuts that he has developed since his time at SLP and Dior. Slimane's work at Celine has been very different from those two tenures. His work has become a lot more decadent or ornate. There's been a lot more reference to historical garments, whether that is historical garments from the late 18th century to the many historical garments rooted in the 70s. His work at Celine has been very focused on the 70s as a time period, so there's a lot less edge. And his work at Celine is also quite considerably taking less from as many subcultures as he used to. But he's getting more creative about what silhouettes he's using, There's a lot more trousers and bell bottoms, but it really moves away from sort of the super sleek look he had at SLP, and it's way less edgy or aggressive of a rock star look than he had at Dior or SLP at all. And again, kind of samples from this like 70s vintage Americana vision. While some do really like and appreciate his work at Celine, the community of Hedi boys who have kind of followed him since his work at Dior or Saint Laurent and gotten really comfortable with that style and aesthetic, some are not as much of a fan of his work at Celine. A lot of them really do like and appreciate it, and there's many fans of his previous work who have followed him over to Celine. There's just also a big chunk of them that also feel like that the sensibilities of his work at Celine don't really have the same appeal. But like I said, Hedi's work at Celine really divided that community. Also, to be honest, while there have been a lot of great moments for Hedi at Celine, there have also been some really awkward moments of Slimane, what I would call career all-time lows, where at this point Slimane is so out of touch with what is youth culture, what is subversive, what is cool, what is interesting, that it just kind of becomes embarrassing when he tries to reach out and touch it. And did some like stuff that was like loosely inspired by SoundCloud rap, TikTok, and e-boy culture. And I guess while it's not really clear if this was from Hedi Slimane's own inspiration or if this was out of like some upper level meddling to appeal to a younger crowd, these looks really did not fit well with the world of Slimane. And for many, sort of the Hedi boy world and lifestyle died with his work at Celine. And sort of the cultish fanboys that became obsessed with his early work, a lot of them really failed to connect with this new vision. By the time that you get to the early 2020s, like I said, the Hedi boy fan base was not as popular in general. But in the early 2020s, there was a new music scene and cultural moment that was launching. Indie sleaze was being resurrected from the dead, with musical acts like the Help, Snow Strippers, Suzy Sheer, Two Hollis, all reinterpreting the electro-clash sound of the 2000s, the one that Hedi helped shape the aesthetics of, bringing back the trance-like cutting synths and dance until you die attitude of this era. A lot of these artists have really sort of recaptured and made that sound interesting again, but now with terrifying lyrical jump scares referencing Nick Land and Immanuel Kant. Particularly the Help and Suzy Sheer have not only been influenced by the likes of Crystal Castle and Justice in a musical sense, but also their style. The style of the original indie sleaze movement, and a big part of this style, of course, was Hedi's work at Dior. Artists like this who are quickly rising from the underground and have these sort of cultish underground fan bases have really sort of been reviving the Hedi boy style. However, the return of the Hedi boy style is a lot different than it has been for the last 25 years. Style is not a copy and paste of Hedi's work, in that these people are just wearing old Hedi Dior or all Hedi SLP. But instead, these people who are bringing back Hedi boy style are inspired by the zeitgeist of it and the sort of creativity that Hedi had at his initial tenure at Dior. I think it's worth noting that Hedi's most successful period, creative-wise, was his time at Dior Homme. He literally established Dior Homme as a label. And this is what people are taking inspiration from. The essence of that early Dior Hedi era. For a long time, to be an Hedi boy, that just meant you wore head-to-toe Saint Laurent, or head-to-toe Dior, or head-to-toe Celine. But now Hedi boy is more around the actual style and styling than it is about wearing Hedi Slimane's actual clothing. And so that means that a lot of these people who are now new Hedi boys, you see a lot of people who are also now wearing Rick Owens, Diesel, Rock Revival, Eric Payne, and of course, jeans from Bosnia. Psst. The jeans from Bosnia are just April 77 and nudie jeans. The new world or the relaunch or rebirth of the Hedi Boy is being redefined and reinterpreted not just as a customer of Hedi Slimane, but instead as someone who's inspired by that initial vision he executed at Dior. You see, what you have to understand about the rebirth of the Hedi Boy is that the Hedi Boy does not have to, in fact, even own any Hedi, but instead he just has to understand the spirit of Hedi, the lifestyle, the essence. As you're seeing now, more and more people are taking up the title of Hedi Boy than ever before, even if they don't own any rare Dior Navigates or Luster jeans. Of course, you're seeing a lot more people be interested in Hedi's work because of the broader indie sleaze trend, which I made a whole video about last year. You can watch it after this one. And while this is a really cool and good thing, this also leaves us with some really weird unanswered questions. What does this mean for Hedi himself? Just as Hedi's style is launching back into popularity, he is actually leaving Celine. And while it's not clear if Hedi would even be interested in creatively entertaining this new crowd of people who are interested in his old work or appealing to them in any way, he probably doesn't even have the means to. When Hedi has left all of these different companies, it's always been over contract disputes. And while it's definitely possible that he has another role lined up for him, it's not likely. Contract disputes with, which makes him pretty risky to put into another creative director role. Manage all these luxury brands like LVMH and Kering. Probably don't want to put him at the helm of another brand right at this exact second. Because while he has made the brands a lot of money, he's hard to deal with. So he probably won't be taking up one of these roles right now. And the truth is he probably can't start his own brand so quickly. It takes a lot of time and effort to start a brand, to find production houses, to get orders made, to do all of these things. It would be pretty impossible for him to start a brand under his own eponymous label or something of the sort. If it's not very likely that one of these big fashion companies will put him in a creative director role, and it's also not very likely that he won't be able to run his own brand, probably won't be able to profit off of this rebirth and reinterest of his clothes. It is very, very likely that Hedi Slimane will not see a dime, even though his style is becoming bigger than ever. Instead, it's likely that other brands inspired by Slimane and his aesthetics will be the ones that profit off of this. When I say it's an Hedi Slimane revival, yes, it is. It's the style that he created, but it won't be his brand that will be selling out and making a lot of money. Instead, it's going to be other people, at least on the primary market. Secondary market, or whatever happens on Grailed, Depop, eBay, that's a whole nother thing. But like I was saying, Hedi doesn't make any money off of residual sales off of his old things from Grailed. So it's likely that other brands will be the ones profiting. Either way, it's all very interesting, and it's cool to see the creative aspects of this reborn. I want to say thank you for watching this video. My name is Carson Craning. If you've made it this far, go check out my brand. I'm also a clothing designer. It would mean a lot to me. Also, just have a great day.